Imagine being the best the world had ever seen at a sport. Imagine holding a record that wouldn't be broken for over 3 decades. And now imagine that somehow it still wasn't enough to win the biggest title in the history of your sport. This is the story of Antonio Krastev, the greatest snatcher the world had ever seen. And just like every Bulgarian weightlifters of that era, Krastev's story starts under the legendary coach Ivan Abadjiev. When he first appears on the Bulgarian national team, he is something the country had never truly seen before. A genuinely world-class super heavyweight lifter. Because despite dominating almost every category in weightlifting, Bulgaria had never really conquered the king class of the sport. That division belonged to the Soviets for decades. But that was about to change because in 1981, Krastev will compete as his first senior world championships and take a bronze in the snatch with 185 kilos. Not exactly historic yet, but the warning signs were there. The real breakthrough will come the following year. At the 1982 World Championships, Krastev will face the new phenomenon of world weightlifting, Anatoly Pisarenko, one of the most known weightlifters of all time. And against all odds, he pushed him far harder than anyone had ever expected. At the time, the heaviest snatch ever completed was still just 202.5 kilos, a record held by Pisarenko himself. And despite the mythical status of the 200 kilo barrier, it had never actually been crossed at a major international competition. Until Antonio Krastev, that is. Not Pisarenko, but Krastev. He will snatch 200 kilos at the World Championships, 2.5 kilos over the Soviet in the very same competition, and an absurd 15 kilos personal best. But somehow, the snatch would not even be the biggest shock of the competition. The clean and jerk will. Just 1 year earlier, Krastev had missed 222.5 kilos, and now he was making 242.5 kilos, 20 kilos more. An unbelievable jump that temporarily pushed him ahead of Pisarenko in the competition. But this is also where the fundamental weakness of Krastev as a weightlifter starts to appear. Because in weightlifting, the snatch comes first. And while it makes up half of the total, every snatch specialist faces a brutal problem. They have to commit first. They cannot know exactly what their opponent are capable of in the clean and jerk. So they are forced to push early and take a secure attempt in the clean and jerk to build the biggest total they possibly can. But a great clean and jerk specialist can play the game very differently, and Pisarenko understood that perfectly. While trailing after the snatch, the Soviet opened with 242.5 kilos, which was the last attempt of Antonio Krastev. And as the Bulgarian was finished, Pisarenko only needed one thing, to load the barbell for the win. And that's exactly what he did. Somewhat of a premonition of what the future of Krastev would look like. After this competition, one thing was clear. Antonio Krastev was no longer just a promising lifter. He was one of the best weightlifters in the world. And more importantly, he was one of the strongest men the sport had ever seen. But in 1983, the first real cracks started to appear. At the World Championships, Krastev will deliver a surprisingly weak performance by his new standards. 190 kilos in the snatch, 232.5 in the clean and jerk. A total nearly 15 kilos below what he had achieved the previous year. And for a lifter whose entire reputation this far was built on an incredible progression rate, that kind of regression immediately stood out. But the biggest problem was not even Krastev himself. It was more so the fact that everyone around him was progressing much faster than he was. While he was very close in 1982, at the 1983 World Championships, Kurlovich from the Soviet Union will snatch 205 kilos for a new world record. And immediately after him, Pisarenko will answer with 206 kilos, another world record and another jump forward in the record books. But somehow, the clean and jerk there was even crazier. Because while both men finished with 245 kilos, both of them attempted over 260 kilos and made the clean. That was more than 20 kilos above the best clean and jerk Antonio Krastev had ever done in his life. And this is where the true limitation of Krastev as a weightlifter became impossible to ignore. Because on a great day, he could still compete with anyone in the world in the snatch. But the clean and jerk was becoming a massive problem. And as we had already seen in 1982, it was going to follow him for the rest of his career, which made the timing even worse. Because the Olympic Games were now approaching. In '84, they were set to take place in Los Angeles, but history had other plans. After the American boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, the Soviet bloc responded by boycotting the '84 Games in the United States. And just like that, Krastev lost his first chance at competing at the Olympic Games, alongside an almost entire generation of Eastern Bloc weightlifters. But somehow, what happened next was even more unbelievable, because while being one of the best weightlifters in the world, Krastev was not even selected for the Friendship Games, the Soviet alternative created to replace the Olympics. And to this day, nobody knows exactly why. There are rumors that the Bulgarian team simply did not fully believe in him, that despite his talent he was not considered really disciplined enough in training, not serious enough, and also not complete enough. Because with the gap in the clean and jerk becoming larger every year, it may have seemed impossible for him to ever truly challenge for the top. So while the greatest super heavyweights in the world battled through what was arguably the strongest era the category had ever seen, Antonio Krastev was sitting at home, and missing 1984 was particularly devastating, because this was very close to the absolute peak of the super heavyweight division. Kurlovich snatched 210 kilos, and Pizorenko clean and jerked 265 kilos, 210 and 265. At the time, these numbers barely even felt real. This was the limit of strength in the 80s, and to this day, these numbers are right around what we know to be possible. The strongest man on earth pushing the sport further than it had ever been pushed. And somehow Antonio Krastev, despite being already one of the greatest snatchers in history, looked further away from the top than ever before. And sadly, when he returned in competition in 1985, not much had really changed. He went to the World Championships once again, and this time he finally won. But not because he had suddenly become unstoppable. The reality was much simpler. The field overall had pretty much collapsed. The two greatest super heavyweights in the world, Anatoly Pizorenko and Alexander Kurlovich, had both been banned after being caught attempting to smuggle steroid into Canada for an international competition. And with the dominant forces of the category suddenly gone, the door was finally open, and Krastev took advantage of it. 202.5 kilos in the snatch for a record, and 235 kilos in the clean and jerk. Enough to become a world champion, but not enough to beat the total personal best. And while those lifts were enormous, there was one problem. His clean and jerk was still much below what he had done even 3 years earlier. Despite years of training, despite the level of the super heavyweights exploding around him, despite entering what should have been the peak of his career, that was not a great sign. But at the same time, Antonio Krastev had still achieved something almost nobody on earth ever could. He had become a world champion in the super heavyweight category. And back then, that title meant something very different than it does today. Before strongman exploded worldwide, before the world's strongest man competition became mainstream, the super heavyweight world champion in weightlifting was pretty much considered the strongest man on earth. And that was the title Krastev now held. But now he had to live up to it. This could have been a perfect ending to his story. A great super heavyweight, a great snatcher, a man who never quite fulfilled the expectations created for him though when he became the first athlete to snatch 200 kilos at a major international competition. But for some reason, that was not enough for Antonio Krastev, because somewhere between 1985 and 1986, something changed, and Krastev suddenly turned into something else entirely. Everything changed at the '86 European Championships, because for the first time in years, Krastev finally looked like the man people believed he could become. He snatched 207.5 kilos for a new personal best, a 5 kilo increase. Then he followed with a 242.5 kilos clean and jerk for 450 kilos total. An enormous result for time and mainly an enormous result for him. He had finally beaten his total from 1982. But the reality is that this was only the beginning, because later that same year at the World Championships, Krastev would attempt something far bigger, the all-time snatch world record. In the snatch, he opened conservatively at 200 kilos. Then immediately he made a statement, a massive jump to 212.5 kilos for a new world record. And he made it. But somehow that still wasn't enough, because Krastev increased the weight on the bar again, 215 kilos. Another world record, a 4 kilo increase on the greatest snatch ever performed before in a single competition. For the first time in his career, Antonio Krastev did not just look competitive, he looked almost unbeatable. And he followed the snatches with a 245 kilos clean and jerk, another personal best, finally, in the clean and jerk, and he finished with 460 kilos total for 10 kilos record. One of the greatest total the sport had ever seen. After years of struggle, after years of being left behind, Antonio Krastev had finally caught up with the monsters of the super heavyweight division. And somehow, he was still not done. In 1987, at the European Championships, he will produce the greatest performance of his entire career. For the first and only time ever, Krastev will become the undisputed strongest weightlifter in the world. But this time, not in the snatch, not just in one lift. In the total, 215 kilos in the snatch, 252.5 kilos in the clean and jerk. A personal best clean and jerk that he would never match again for the rest of his career. And together, these lifts offered to him the all-time world record total, the most prized possession in the sport of weightlifting. For one brief moment, Antonio Krastev stood at the absolute top of weightlifting. But somehow, even that is not how you should remember this competition. Because after making 215 kilos in the snatch, Krastev did something that would become one of the greatest legends in weightlifting history. He called for 220 kilos. And to understand why that mattered so much, you have to go back years earlier. Back before the 200 kilos barrier had ever been broken. Back when Krastev was still a young lifter, with a snatch somewhere around 160 to 170 kilos. At the time, he had told his coach that one day he believed he would snatch 230 kilos. And even by Bulgarian standards, that sounded insane. The coach reportedly told him that if absolutely everything went perfectly, maybe he could one day snatch 200. And if he became the greatest lifter in history, maybe he could push into the low 210s. But Krastev believed something else entirely. He saw himself lifting weights that nobody thought were possible. So when he loaded 220 kilos onto the bar at the 1987 European Championships, it was not just another world record attempt. It was a step toward a vision he had carried for years, toward the true limits of his abilities. Krastev did not approach 220 kilos like an impossible weight. He approached it more so like a milestone, like something that he simply had to do on the road to 230 kilos. He will ultimately miss the attempt, but he missed it the best possible way, behind, which meant one thing. Antonio Krastev was physically able to snatch 220 kilos. So by the time the 87 World Championships arrived, the plan was pretty obvious. Open light, jump to the world record of now 216 kilos, then take the jump to 220, 2 record attempts in a row, just like at Worlds 1 year prior. But things do not always go according to plan. At the World Championships, Krastev opened heavier than ever before, 205 kilos, and for one of the very rare times in his career, he missed it. That immediately changed everything, because now Krastev could no longer afford a huge jump to 220 kilos. He had to first secure the world record and a solid lift to secure his place on the podium. So instead of gambling everything immediately, he repeated the opener, 205 again. A smart decision, because he made it. After that, he moved to 216 kilos for his third attempt, an 11 kilo jump for another world record. Just like everyone would have expected, he made it. The lift looked slightly shakier than most of his previous record attempts, but it was still extraordinary, 216 kilos, the heaviest snatch ever completed. But again, while Krastev was still making history, the rest of the super heavyweight division had finally caught up, because Krlovic rose up to the occasion, 212.5 kilos in the snatch. Not enough to beat Krastev, but still the second heaviest snatch of all time. And unlike Krastev, Krlovic had one enormous advantage, the clean jerk. He went on to make 260 kilos and secure the overall victory with relative ease. And when he even attempted 266 kilos afterward, a lift that ended up being turned down by the jury, it suddenly felt like the balance of power had shifted again. Mere month after Krastev had broken the all-time total world record, it was taken away from him. And once again, he looked left behind. But with the 88 Olympic Games now approaching, Antonio Krastev was not ready to disappear. Krlovic was terrifying, Taranenko was rising fast, but neither man looked unbeatable. So Krastev went back to training, and he trained pretty hard. In one of the only available training videos of his career, filmed sometimes between late 1987 and early 1988, we can see exactly how Antonio Krastev prepared for the Olympics. And the best way that I could describe it is very Bulgarian. He went heavy, he missed, and then went heavier, missed, and went heavier again. And he didn't care. He truly believed that all the lifts that were loaded on the bar, he could do. The biggest successful lifts from the session were a 210 kilo snatch and a 245 kilo clean jerk. Numbers that already reflected one of the strongest men alive at the time. But the truly crazy part of the session comes afterward, because we also see Krastev attempt 220 kilos in the snatch, and not one time, not 2 times, but 3 times. And while he will fail all 3 attempts, the fact he believed in himself enough to keep attempting it is pretty crazy. And in the clean jerk, it could have been arguably even crazier, because in this training session, we can see him attempting north of 260 kilos and up to what I believe to be right around 270 kilos in the clean. That is not a particularly close attempt by any means, but once again, the pure belief in himself that Krastev had at this time was just unfathomable. According to stories that circulated later on, Krastev's training only became more absurd after this training video. Before the 88 Olympics, Krastev allegedly totaled 480 kilos in training twice. Once with a 220.5 kilo snatch combined with a 257.5 kilo clean jerk, and the other time with a 220 kilo snatch and a 260 kilos clean jerk. And this was, at the time, 7.5 kilos above the official world record. And for the first time in his career, everything seemed to be coming together at once. And heading to Seoul, it generally felt like the super heavyweight battle was not going to be one-sided at all. But just before the Olympics, there was still one final stop, the 88 European Championships. And strangely enough, Krastev looked pretty terrible there. For the first time in years, he failed to even reach 205 kilos in a snatch, finishing with only 202.5 kilos, a number massively below what he was allegedly capable of. Krastev seemed to almost drift through the competition, despite reportedly being in incredible shape in training. But at the time, we have to say that it did not seem too concerning. Krlovic was not even competing at the Europeans, and while Taranenko was there, Krastev still looked like a legitimate Olympic contender. Up to the very beginning of the Seoul Olympics, Antonio Krastev was ready. He was ready for his biggest competition ever, ready for the moment he had spent almost a decade chasing. But then everything collapsed. Following a major doping controversy involving the Bulgarian team, 2 Bulgarian lifters will test positive during the Games. What happened next would become one of the most infamous moments in Olympic weightlifting history. The Bulgarian Federation withdrew nearly half of their entire team from the competition. And just like that, Antonio Krastev's Olympic dream died for a second time. No battle with Krlovic, no chances at Olympic gold. And after years of chasing the greatest weight the world had ever seen, Antonio Krastev would never compete at the Olympic Games. But despite everything that happened in Seoul, one thing still remained. Antonio Krastev was the greatest snatcher in the world. Taranenko later on broken the clean jerk and the total world record. He had pushed it to a totally new level, but the 216 kilo snatch survived, untouched. Krlovic came incredibly close in 1989 with 216 kilos, but even that was still 1 kilo short. And somehow 216 began to feel different. Not just like a world record, but more like a wall. A weight that everybody could approach, but nobody could quite cross. Meanwhile, Krastev slowly started to disappear from the top level of the sport. After years chasing impossible numbers, he stepped away from competition for a pretty long period of time. And little by little, the shape that had made him one of the greatest athletes in the world started to fade. After the disaster of the '88 Olympics, Antonio Krastev pretty much walked away from weightlifting, at least for a while. He left Bulgaria and moved to New York City, the United States, where he started building a completely new life away from the platform. And slowly, over time, he began training again. Of course, he would never fully return to the level he had once reached. Nobody comes back from so many years away and become the same athlete again. But somehow, nearly 8 years after the peak of his career, Krastev still had one final goal left, the Olympic Games. In the lead-up to the '96 Atlanta Olympics, he attempted an incredible comeback, this time hoping to represent the United States. And even years removed from his prime, the numbers he was lifting were still absurd. Reports from his preparation mention snatches up to 200 kilos and clean jerks around 250 kilos. Numbers that would have put him on the podium of the Olympic Games. But once again, fate intervened. Krastev was unable to obtain American citizenship in time to qualify for the Games. And just like that, his Olympic dream died for a third and final time. And that is how the career of Antonio Krastev ends. A man who, for 31 years, held the heaviest snatch ever performed by a human being, and yet somehow never even competed at the Olympics, despite more than a decade at the absolute top of international weightlifting. But then, in 2017, another giant finally appeared. Lasha Talahadze broke the record. First with 217 kilos, then 220. The barrier Krastev himself had attempted decades earlier had finally fallen. And in a strange way, the dream he once carried became reality. The 220 kilo snatch was finally real, and a new king of the snatch had arrived. But sadly, Antonio Krastev would not get to see the story continue for very long. In 2020, he will pass in a car accident. He never saw Lasha Talahadze push the record even further to 225 kilos, just 5 kilos away from the dream he had spoken about all the way back in the 1970s. All throughout this video, you probably saw Antonio Krastev wear what is a singlet that doesn't look anything like modern weightlifting singlets, and that's for a very simple reason. they don't exist anymore. Or at least they didn't, because we brought them back with vintage lifts, and you can now get yours, a legless singlet, style of the 80s, on the website with the link in description. Thank you for watching the video, and make sure to subscribe.